During the past few decades, the world economy has become increasingly integrated through trade, tourism, and other activities. And all these activities illustrate evidence of globalization. In this section of the course, we are now interested in looking at what we call trade policy and why do economies tend to trade with each other. I do believe that up until now, you now realize that on your own, you can do much, but with the help of your colleagues, you can specialize and be able to maximize on the understanding of different concepts in this course. And this is the same with different economies by the fact that each economy can specialize in the production of a specific good and they can exchange the good with other countries, and this could bring about gains from trade, and these two countries can be well better off than when they are closed up. So what we see in today's economies is that most of the economies are much more open to trade, and for South Africa, the degree of openness is relatively large, and this degree of openness is normally being assessed by the level of exports and imports that a country normally has. A few decades ago, most countries tried to be self sufficient in the sense that most of them believe that it is more efficient for them to protect their domestic economic systems from trade since their producers were not competitive enough to compete with foreign competition. But that leads to a great inefficiency within the economic system. Therefore, by opening up an economic system, the economy can benefit quite a lot through specialization. This concept of specialization was introduced by Adam Smith in 1776, who argued for benefit of specialization and division of labor in the world of nations. He wrote, I quote, "It is the maxim of every prudent master of a family never to attempt to make at home what it will cost him more to make than to buy. What is prudent in the conduct of every private family can scarce be folly in that of a great kingdom. If a foreign country can supply us with a commodity cheaper than we ourselves can make it, better buy it from them with some part of the produce of our own industry employed in a way in which we have some advantage." This then simply means that there is benefits from international trade if we specialize, and as we specialize we make sure that the production of goods and services or the use of scarce resources is put to efficient use, and we can maximize and improve the welfare of both trading countries. International trade happens for a number of basic of reasons. The first reason is that the factors of production are not evenly distributed amongst all countries. For example, in South Africa, we might be well endowed with natural resources, but we don't have some type of natural resources such as rubber. So in case we need rubber for the production of our own car tires, we have to make sure that we trade with a country that have got such a natural resource so that we can be able to benefit from the production of such a service. Or the same might happen with that country that has an abundance of rubber. They might not have one of the produce that we have here in South Africa, which is an abundance of wool. So, in case they need some wool, we can then have a mutual agreement where we trade the rubber for wool, and at the end of the day, you would find that in South Africa you can have access to rubber, whilst also in another country where they didn't have an opportunity to have who they can now have the opportunity to have access to it through international trade. So there are indeed benefits from trade. So you guys, that's why you are encouraged to interact in group discussion, because those also leads to benefits in this course for you, in a way that your intellectual capacity get then developed by the interaction between you and your peers. So don't essentially drop all the discussion thinking that they are not important. They are very important for your intellectual building. As we have earlier stated, that with international trade there are gains from trade. The first way in which gains from trade was introduced by Adam Smith was through the concept called absolute advantage. By absolute advantage, what happens is, if we have two countries, these two countries can benefit from trade with each other on the basis that one country produce a specific good much more efficient than the other country. So if we have South Africa and Zimbabwe, and we only have shirts and cell phones, and we assume that in Zimbabwe they can produce 100 shirts or 5 cell phones per week, but in South Africa they can produce 50 shirts or 10 cell phones per week. Then it means that the labor in Zimbabwe is much more productive in the production of shirts per week as compared to South Africa. And then the South African labor is also much more efficient in the production of cell phones than the production of shirts. Therefore, the workers in South Africa should specialize in the production of cell phones, and then those in Zimbabwe should specialize in the production of shirts. And if they do that, they would then be able to trade the excesses or their surpluses, and both countries could gain from that trade. But unfortunately, what tends to happen within economic system is that at times we find that one country could have both absolute advantage in the production of one good, which simply means that they are more efficient in the production of both shirts and cell phones than the other country. So should we really rule out the advantages of trade or trade between these two countries? In the 19th century, David Ricardo then formulated the law of comparative advantage, in which he then says that international trade can still be beneficial if one country has got absolute advantage in the production of both goods, and the other country has got an absolute disadvantage in the production of uh, both goods. The law of comparative advantage, as postulated by David Ricardo, looks at the opportunity cost of production. In here, David Ricardo argues that as long as there is a difference between the opportunity cost of production between the two countries, there is a room for international trade between these two countries, and the two countries can trade the goods and services much more efficiently without any problems. To illustrate the gains from trade using the law of comparative advantage, let's look at the example of Yemen and South Africa, that they are producing cars and wines. And as we can see from the table here, it shows that Yemen has an absolute advantage in the production of both cars and wine as compared to South Africa. However, using comparative advantage, we can find ways in which these two countries can benefit from trade, since their opportunity cost of production or relative prices differs between the two countries. So in Germany, the cost of producing two cars is 8 barrels of wine. By using scarce labor resources to produce two cars, Germany forgoes the opportunity to produce 8 barrels of wine. Assuming cost and cost opportunity cost, this means that the cost to Germany of producing one car is 4 barrels of wine. But in South Africa, 6 barrels of wine have to be sacrificed to produce one car. Thus, it costs relatively less to produce cars in Germany than it does in South Africa. Germany has to give out fewer barrels of wine to produce a car than South Africa. On the other hand, the opportunity cost of producing wine is lower in South Africa than in Germany. To produce 6 barrels of wine, South Africa has to sacrifice one car. The opportunity cost of producing 1 barrel of wine is thus 1/6 of cost of producing a car. In Germany, the cost of producing 4 barrels of wine is one car. The opportunity cost of producing 1 barrel of wine in Germany is thus 1/4. The cost of producing a car. It does cost relatively less to produce wine in South Africa than it does in Germany. Thus, although Germany has an absolute advantage over South Africa in the production of both goods, it does not have a relative advantage in both goods. Put differently, Germany is in absolute terms twice as efficient in the production of cars than South Africa, but it is only marginally more efficient in producing wine. This implies that Germany is relatively more efficient in the production of cars, whereas South Africa is relatively more efficient in the production of wine. Therefore, the two countries can benefit from trade if South Africa specializes in the production of wine and Germany specializes in the production of cars, and then Germany would export the cars to South Africa while South Africa exports the wine to Germany. According to the theory or law of comparative advantage, each country will tend to specialize in and export those goods for which it has got a comparative advantage. In our example, both Germany and South Africa has an incentive to specialize in trade, provided that a mutual benefit trading ratio is established. Each country will undertake the shift of resources required for specialization only if there are certainly demonstrable gains to be had from trading. South Africa, for example, will be willing to shift its resources into wine production only if it can exchange fewer than 6 barrels of wine for a car from Germany. Likewise, Germany will be willing to shift its resources into car production only if it can obtain more than 4 barrels of wine for every car it sends to South Africa. In our example, both countries would thus gain from trade only if one car is exchanged for more than 4 but fewer than 6 barrels of wine. Suppose one car is exchanged for 5 barrels of wine. Germany gains from trade. For each car Germany sends to South Africa, it receives 5 barrels of wine in exchange, and thus makes sense for Germany to shift labor resources from wine production to car production and trade the excess production of cars. Without international trade, Germany could produce and consume only 4 barrels of wine for each car sacrificed. After international trade, Germany can now import and consume 5 barrels of wine for each car given up. Alternatively, South Africa gains from trade. For each 5 barrels of wine South Africa sends to Germany, it receives 1 car in exchange. It thus makes sense for South Africa to shift labor resources from car production to wine production and trade the excess production of wine. Without international trade, South Africa could produce and consume only 1 car for each 6 barrels of wine sacrificed. After international trade, South Africa can import and consume 1 car for each 5 barrels of wine given up. However, note that international trade will occur only if comparative advantage exists, that is, if the opportunity cost differs between these two countries. And also, it will only occur if both countries will gain from trade. Therefore, the terms of trade or the ratio within which these two goods are to be exchanged should be beneficial for both countries. Otherwise, the other country will not find any interest in trading since they are not benefiting from it. The theory of absolute advantage and comparative advantage are the basic theories in explaining international trade between two countries. There's quite a number of other theories that have been developed by economists in terms of trying to explain why countries trade. So this is the basics or the preliminary ways in which countries gains from trade. For this course, it is not really important for us to go deep into the reasons why or the different theories that explains international trade. These two are relatively okay for you guys to understand the importance of international trade from the concept of opportunity cost. Although international trade is beneficial for both countries, at times it tends to have a negative effect to other countries. In such cases where local firms are not able to compete with international firms, hence the local government would find it um, important that they intervene in the market by protecting their local firms in order for them to grow and become competent to foreign competition. There is quite a number of ways within which the local government can use in order to protect domestic firms, and these include the use of import tariff, import quotas, subsidies, non-tariff barriers, exchange controls, as well as the exchange rate. Import tariffs are duties or taxes imposed on products imported into a country. They are generally used to protect domestic industry or sectors from foreign competition, but it can be shown that they have result in a net loss of welfare to domestic society. And since the intervention or the advent of the World Trade Organization, these had been kept as low as possible. Import quotas seeks to control the physical level of import and are therefore a form of indirect intervention in the market mechanism. They have much more economic consequences as import tariffs. Subsidies granted to home producers have essentially the same economic impact as taxes on imported goods. Non-tariff barriers has become increasingly significant in recent years. They take the form or, for example, discriminatory administrative practices such as deliberate channeling government contracts to domestic firms, insisting on certain technical standards or specifications that may be difficult for foreign firms to meet, special licensing requirements, or simply unnecessary red tape. Exchange rate control can also be used to restrict imports by limiting the amount of foreign currency available for purchase. The exchange rate policy movements in exchange rate may have significant effects on exports and imports, and the exchange rate policy may therefore be a much more effective instrument for influencing international trade than the traditional instruments of trade policy such as tariff, quotas, and subsidies. International trade often involves payments in foreign currencies. The exchange rate refers to the rate at which currencies are exchanged. That is, it reflects the price of one currency in terms of the other. In principle, the exchange rate is not a difficult concept to understand. It simply represents the price of one currency in terms of another. However, it is important to be alert when dealing with exchange rate. One must be careful to establish from which point of view an exchange rate is being approached. When there is an increase in the value or price of one currency in terms of another currency, we call that an appreciation. And that automatically means that the other currency has automatically depreciated. Another term for appreciation is called revaluation. And then another term for depreciation is called devaluation. The term appreciation and depreciation is normally used when we are dealing with um, a flexible exchange rate. But when we are dealing with a fixed exchange rate, we use the term revaluation and devaluation to just reflect uh, an increase in the value of the price of one currency in terms of the other, respectively. So, how then are these exchange rates determined? And who is responsible for determining them? These exchange rates are determined within the foreign exchange market. This is the market for the demand for foreign currency and the supply for foreign currency. And these currencies are then exchanged in this foreign exchange market. So when we deal with this foreign exchange market, it is always important for you to always check which currency is being analyzed, because the exchange rate always involves two currencies. In order for us to understand what happens within the foreign exchange market, let us use an example of the South African market for US dollars and be able to understand what's happening in this market, so as for us to have a general view of how the exchange rate is determined within such a market. So remember, on figure 4.2, the vertical axis measures the price of the dollar, which is the exchange rate of the rand to the dollar, whilst on the horizontal axis we measure the quantities of dollars per day that is demanded or supplied within this market. So let's first dissect the two curves, which is your demand and supply curves, and be able to understand them independently. Then we can put them back together when we have a greater view or a good understanding of them. So the first question that you would ask yourself is, who are the guys that are in demand for US dollars? So the guys that demand US dollars are those who hold rand but wants to exchange them for US dollars. So this comes from a number of sources. And the first source is South African importers who import goods and services for which they pay in US dollars. The second source is South African residents who wish to purchase dollar-denominated assets such as shares in American companies. The third source is American investors who sell their South African assets and wish to convert their proceeds into US dollars. The fourth source is South African tourists who wants to buy dollars. Another important source is speculators who anticipate a decline in the value of the rand relative to the dollar. The general rule is that the more expensive the dollars are, the smaller will be the quantities of dollars demanded, ceteris paribus. So this reflects a negative slope for the demand for dollars. What about the supply of dollars? Those who supply dollars are holders of dollars who want to exchange them for rands. The supply of dollars comes from various sources. The first source is South African exporters who export goods and services. The foreign buyers of South African exports, whose prices are quoted in dollars, supply dollars which are then exchanged for rands. A second source is foreign holders of dollars who purchase South African assets, e.g. shares on the JSE or government stock. They also supply dollars. Another example is South African investors who sell foreign assets denominated in dollars and convert these proceeds back into rands. Furthermore, foreign tourists in South Africa who exchange dollars for rands and speculators who anticipate a rise in the value of rands relative to the dollars are also the suppliers of the US dollars. The supply of dollars is positively related to the rand-dollar exchange rate. As the rand price of the dollar falls, the quantity of South African exports demanded by Americans and therefore also the quantity of dollars supplied will fall. The supply curve therefore has a positive slope. The equilibrium exchange rate is the rate at which the quantity of dollars demanded equals the quantity of dollars supplied. In figure 4.2, this is indicated by the exchange rate of $1 is equals to 14 rand. The quantity exchanged at this exchange rate is $10 billion. At a higher price of $1 is equals to 16 rand, there will be excess supply of dollars. At a lower price of $1 is equals to 12 rand, there will be an excess demand for dollars. This example shows market forces determine the exchange rate. We choose the dollar because the rand-dollar exchange rate is regarded as a basic exchange rate in South Africa foreign market. The rate against all other currencies are derived from such a relationship, and similar calculations are made in respect of other currencies. The figure has shown how the market for US dollars in South Africa is determined. It is important for us to have a clear understanding of the forces that drives the demand and supply of dollars within an economic system, as these tend to influence the fluctuations within the exchange rates themselves. So now, to understand the concept of exchange rate, let's now look at the changes in supply and demand, or when there is a currency depreciation or an appreciation, and see how that changes the situation or the equilibrium situation that we have analyzed so far. Anything that causes a change in the supply or demand for foreign exchange will result in a change in the exchange rate, ceteris paribus. When dollars become more expensive, we say the dollars have appreciated against the rand, or that the rand has depreciated against the dollar. Similarly, for in the price of the dollar implies that the dollar has depreciated against the rand and that the rand has appreciated against the dollar. So in terms of figure 4.3, a change in the supply of dollars would either shift the demand curve to the right if it's an increase or to the left if it's a decrease. And a change in the demand for dollars would either shift the demand curve to the right if it is an increase or to the left if it is a decrease. Let's now consider a decrease in dollars. For example, when households or firms or the government in the United States imports fewer South African goods. This will cause the supply curve to shift to S1. As the supply curve shifts to S1, a new equilibrium point is determined where $1 is now being exchanged for 15 rand. As a result of this change, 8 billion US dollars are now being demanded per day as opposed to 10 billion. Now, to analyze what has happened, we have to look at what has happened in the case of the dollar to the rand. In this case, the dollar has become more expensive in terms of the rand. That is, the dollar has appreciated against the rand. This then implies that the rand has depreciated against the dollar, ceteris paribus. Similar analysis can be used to express when the rand appreciates and the dollar depreciates, or when the rand depreciates and the dollar appreciates, in terms of whether the supply curve or the demand curve for dollar is increasing or decreasing. For example, when there is rightward shift in the demand curve, you would see that the rand would depreciate whereas the dollar would appreciate. However, if there is a leftward shift in the demand curve, we tend to see the dollar appreciating and the rand depreciating. So we can still just work on the framework and see what happens to the new equilibrium when there is a leftward or a rightward shift in the demand curve, which is being caused by a change in the guys that are holding the US dollar or that are in need of the US dollar, which is the interaction between demand and supply within this market. When the dollar appreciates, imports from the United States becomes more expensive in South Africa, and South African exports to the United States becomes cheaper. This will tend to dampen imports and stimulate exports. Similarly, when the dollar depreciates, that is when the rand appreciates, imports from the United States becomes cheaper in South Africa, but South African exports to the United States becomes more expensive in that country. This will tend to stimulate imports and dampen exports. A change in the exchange rate is a double-edged sword. South African exporters, for example, generally prefer a depreciation of the rand since it makes their goods more competitive on international markets, ceteris paribus. But a depreciation raises the price of imported goods and services. These prices increases then feeds into the inflation process and tend to raise inflation. When the authority wish to combat inflation, they prefer an appreciation of the rand, but these then tend to reduce the competitiveness of our export in the short run at least, and to stimulate imports. These effects are summarized in the table 4.2. From the brief discussion, it should be obvious that the question of the appropriate international value of currency is quite a complex one. If the exchange rate market is left to operate on its own, exchange rates tend to fluctuate quite considerably, since the demand for and supply of foreign exchange are not synchronized on a day-to-day basis. A freely floating exchange rate is also subjected to speculation because of the potential volatility of exchange rate, and because the authorities often wish to use the exchange rate to pursue particular policy objective, exchange rates are often managed. This is called managed floating. To illustrate managed floating, let's assume that the original demand curve and original supply curve on figure 4.4 are denoted by DD and SS, and the equilibrium exchange rate is 1 US dollar for 14 rand, and 10 billion US dollars are exchanged in the market. Suppose there is an increase in demand for US dollars, the demand curve will shift to the right, and the new equilibrium will be at E1, where 1 US dollar is now being exchanged for 15 rand. So if the South African government does not want the US dollar to appreciate and their currency to depreciate, what they could do is to deposit or supply 1 billion rands to the market, given that they do have the necessary resource or reserves to supply to the market. And if they do that, the supply of dollars would shift from SS to S1, and the new equilibrium will now be at $1 for 14 rand. But now the amount of dollars that are being exchanged in the market are now 11 billion. So the central bank can pursue such activities or manage the exchange rate, given that they have got reserves to do so. Otherwise, if they don't have sufficient reserves, they might be in trouble, since they cannot hold the exchange rate to a specific value for quite a long time, then they have to let it to float. The use of reserves to support the exchange rate has been effectively dropped from international trade, since international financial transaction has almost made it impossible for governments to sustain such managed floats for quite a number of periods. In most of the cases, when the government tries to do such activities, they run down their gold and reserves and foreign exchange reserves to the extent that they'll be left with nothing. So most governments nowadays normally leave their exchange rates to float. From the foregoing analysis, it is important to know that exchange rates are important economic indicators in any small economic system, and their management are quite vital for quite a number of players within the system. So managing them might be beneficial for a few parties within the economy, but it tends to have its own share of prices for doing so, which means that the government have to forego its gold and foreign reserves just in order for them to favor either importers or exporters, depending on what is happening in the exchange rate. Therefore, it is important for the central bank to ensure that they have got the appropriate exchange rate policy in order for the economic system to be much more stable. For a small economy like South Africa, we depend on imported oil and capital goods. The external value of the rand directly influences the rand amount that we pay for such imports. A weaker rand thus has a direct impact on the cost and prices of these domestic um, products.